All right, so today we're going to jump into a pretty pointed historical narrative. It's from an online text called Cultures of North America, the Irish. And just to be clear, our goal here is simply to explain the argument this author is making step by step. So, let's dive in.
So the author kind of kicks things off by asking, what really defines the Irish-American experience? Before we even get into their argument, it's a good question to ask yourself. What's the first thing that pops into your head? Just hold that thought for a minute.
And there it is. This is the source's starting point. It throws out this modern stereotype, this image of, tough, urban Catholic fighters from Boston. But right away, the author uses this to set up a big contrast, basically arguing that this is just one tiny piece of a much, much more complicated story. And this right here is the core idea of the entire text. The author's whole thesis is that you can't talk about one Irish immigration. They say, no, there were two totally different waves. You had an early, mostly Protestant group they call Scotch-Irish, and then you had the later, 19th century Catholic group. And pretty much everything else in the text flows from this one big idea.
Okay, so let's dig into that first wave. The author argues that this group got here a lot earlier and, because of that, left a completely different kind of footprint on America.
And according to the author, the history here goes way, way back. It supposedly starts in the 1500s with the Spanish, picks up with Presbyterians coming from Ulster in the 1600s, and even includes single Catholic men coming as indentured servants in the 1700s. The source makes a point of saying a lot of them died before they were even free. But the really big moment, the major influx the author focuses on, is a wave of Ulster Protestants right after the American Revolution.
So the author paints this really specific picture, right? They were mostly Protestant, they didn't settle in the big cities, they went out to the rural backwoods of places like Pennsylvania and the Carolinas and became the dominant culture there. And here's the kicker. The author claims the term Scotch-Irish itself only became a thing later on, specifically so this group could separate themselves from all the new Catholic immigrants arriving in the 1800s.
And the source puts a big number on this wave, 600,000. The author uses this figure to frame this immigration as a massive demographic event all on its own, happening long before the Great Famine even started.
All right, so that's the first wave. Now let's pivot to the second wave. This is the story most of us are probably more familiar with, a story that's tied directly to one of the biggest humanitarian disasters of the 19th century.
And if you thought the first number was big, look at this. The scale here is just staggering. The source says 3.7 million Irish people came over between 1840 and 1920. They were overwhelmingly Catholic, and they were fleeing the potato famine. According to the author, this influx just completely changed what it meant to be Irish in America.
And this slide really gets to the heart of the author's argument. It's a tale of two very different settlements. The first wave, rural, backwoods homesteaders. The second wave, totally urban. They packed into the cities, forming these tight-knit communities and becoming the workforce for a country that was industrializing at a crazy pace.
Specifically, the text says this group was basically the muscle behind America's growth. They built the railroads, they dug the Erie Canal, they put up cities like Kansas City. The author argues that their labor was absolutely essential, but it also kept them in these really tough, often dangerous, blue-collar jobs.
Now, the author makes a pretty controversial claim when it comes to the Civil War. They actually cite the movie Gangs of New York and claim that, contrary to what we might think, the Irish were proportionally the least likely to serve. And they say the Irish-born Confederate troops were the most likely of any regiment to defect. The author presents this as a direct challenge to the popular narrative.
Okay, so from here, the author makes a big pivot. They move away from the historical claims and start making connections to the present day. And it's really important to flag this. What's coming up are the author's own interpretations, connecting their version of history to today.
And the author makes some pretty sweeping connections. They claim that a willingness to commit violence and follow orders is why so many Irish Americans became police officers and firefighters. Then there's this really odd aside, where they claim the Irish drove the need for paneling. Yeah, paneling in houses and cars. And politically, the author says their urban history is why they fully adopted leftist ideologies.
And then the text includes this really inflammatory quote about Irish women. The author asserts they were well known for being prostitutes in cities like Philadelphia and New York, and that this legacy, in their view, continued into the adult film industry. We're showing you this quote directly from the source so you can see exactly what it says.
So, all of this builds up to the author's final conclusion. Their big, final, and very blunt assessment that tries to tie this whole argument together into one
let's say, provocative statement.
And here it is, quoted word for word. The author's final take is that the Irish are dirty people, and that 700 years of British rules stopped them from developing their own culture, and that we're seeing the fallout from that today. This is the ultimate point the author was building towards.
And to really hammer the point home, the author leaves the reader with this rhetorical question. They basically challenge you to think of a single, valuable, tangible thing from Irish culture that you use in your daily life. It's meant to be a final little jab to support their argument.
So if we step back from this specific and, let's be honest, very controversial text, it leaves us with a much bigger question, right? It doesn't really matter if you agree with it or not. It's a powerful example of how you can build a historical narrative to make a very specific, very pointed argument. And it makes you wonder, how do these kinds of stories, good, bad, accurate, or not, how do they actually shape how a group is seen by the world, and maybe more importantly, how they see themselves?